Israel does want peace on their terms.
This is a difficult topic, and there's no way to say anything meaningful about it without offending people. But I think it's important to discuss nonetheless.
True.
As I've said on this show and on a few of my Joe Rogan appearances over the past few years, I believe that in the war between Israel and Hamas, the Israelis are the good guys and Hamas are the bad guys. That may seem like a cartoonish way to describe the situation, or
It's definitely a cartoonish way to describe it, but let's continue.
or it might seem like an obscene opinion given the images of emaciated children that you've probably seen over the past few weeks, but it's still the truth. And it's a truth that's incredibly easy to lose sight of amid the day-to-day coverage of this war. In my view, the deepest tragedy in the war right now is that both sides have committed war crimes, and in both cases, those war crimes are falling on Palestinian civilians. The truth, of course, is that every war features war crimes, but usually each army commits those crimes against the enemy's population. In this case, the Palestinians of Gaza have received a double dose of the excesses of each side. But here's the crucial point. That doesn't make both sides morally equal. Let me begin by making something clear. When I say that the Israelis are the good guys in this war, I'm not saying that everything the IDF does is justifiable, far from it. And I'm not saying that Israeli soldiers haven't committed war crimes. Certainly they have. What I mean is that Israel's goals as a country are far more benign and ethical than Hamas's goals. Israel's goal is to live in peace with its neighbors. Now, you can focus on the far-right faction within Israel that wants more than that, but it's just that. It's one faction within a democracy, no more representative of the will of Israelis than AOC or Marjorie Taylor Greene represents the will of Americans.
So there's actually a fair bit of truth to this, and I know this is controversial. If Israel didn't face any threat from their neighbors and no threat from Palestinians, then they wouldn't just be invading countries for the sake of it. That's true. But what's also true is that there have always been expansionist elements within Israeli society that have taken advantage of violence from our neighbors to achieve their expansionist goals. Now, it's also not so simple to say, okay, well, Israel just wants to live in peace while they don't, because once you have the upper hand and once you gain your territory and your sovereignty, you're more likely to be okay with the situation than the people who you displaced and took their land from. Right? So let's just take some other historical examples. And this isn't a perfect example, but let's say when the early Europeans arrived to the Americas, it's true that in reality, their goal was to continue taking all the Americas. But let's say they just said, you know, we're just going to take the whole coastline. That's it. We're done. We want peace, guys. We want peace. And then the Native Americans would be like, no, what do you mean peace? You just took our entire coastline. There's no peace. And then Coleman Hughes of the early 1500s would say, between the Native Americans and the colonies, one just wants to live in peace while the other wants to destroy those colonies. Right? When you look at it in that way, it's kind of a ridiculous way to look at it. So it is true that Israel does not want to keep conquering land and doesn't want to kill for the sake of killing. Israel does want peace on their terms. But it makes sense why the population that got 70% of the land they were historically living on taken from them, and with more and more expansion in the whatever small amount of land they have left, why they're not okay with Israel just wanting peace. So that framing is just problematic. It misses an important nuance.
By and large, Israelis don't want to conquer Gaza. In fact, they left Gaza voluntarily in 2005, and they don't want to wipe Gaza off the map. If they wanted that, they could have done it any time in the last several decades. With their advantage and firepower, they could do it now in a matter of weeks. And you should ask yourself why they don't. Hamas, on the other hand...
That's false. They could have done it. No. Being able to technically do it and having the military means to do it doesn't mean it's politically feasible. Doesn't mean the world will let you do it. So to say if they wanted to, they would have, that's not true. That's not true. Many Israelis, especially now, would want to destroy all of Gaza, but we can't. We're not allowed to. The world won't let us. He's implying that the reason why Israel isn't just getting rid of all Gazans is out of the kindness of their heart. But could you imagine if the world wasn't paying attention and nobody cared about what happened to Gaza? Would there still be a Gaza left? Would there still be Gazans in Gaza? I don't think so. So to frame this as the reason they're doing it is because we're being virtuous or kind. No, man.
Does want to conquer Israel and wipe it off the map. And they would be happy to do what they did on October 7th to the entire country. That's what I mean when I say that the two sides in this war are not the same. There's a huge moral asymmetry between them, and that matters.
That's another thing. The whole thing of trying to compare morality between people in very different circumstances, there's no good way to do a comparison. Your moral outlook on life, the tactics, the military tactics you're going to use are very much dependent on how much power you have. Who's more immoral? A criminal who murders somebody or a police officer? There was this story this week that the video of the black man stabbing the Ukrainian refugee on the bus, that was fucked up. So that guy, right? He should be locked up, obviously. What he did is horrific. Let's say you have a situation where a cop is doing a traffic stop and they feel threatened, and then they just open fire and kill 4 kids in the car unnecessarily. It wasn't intentional. It wasn't as brutal. It was a mistake. Who's morally worse? Now, again, it's just an analogy to try to show that it's not all about intention. It's not all about the brutality of what you do. How you act, how you behave is very much dependent on the amount of power you have. So this whole moral comparisons, they're nearly impossible to do because we're talking about completely different situations. I don't see any value in trying to do the moral comparison. But if you want to, what's morally worse? Killing 850 civilians or going on 100,000 civilians? What's worse, killing 38 children or killing 20,000 children?
The point I'm making here is right on the surface of how we look at most wars in history. It's possible to agree with the goals of an army, but condemn its methods. In fact, it's not just possible, it's actually most people's default view of most wars, including just wars. Many people take that attitude towards dropping atomic bombs on Japan, for instance. Or when you learn about the Union Army burning down 40% of Atlanta, including civilian homes during the Civil War, most of us respond by thinking, wow, that was terrible, and some of it must have been unnecessary, but the North was still the good guy in that war. Why were they the good guys? Not because they were the underdogs. In fact, they weren't. Not because they suffered more war crimes. In fact, the South almost certainly suffered more war crimes, but because their goals were more benign. The South was fighting to preserve slavery, and the North was fighting to end it. If not at the beginning of the war, then certainly by the end. In other words, the goals that each side is fighting for matter a great deal. That's not to say that goals are the only things that matter. How armies conduct themselves matters too. And it's very easy to find examples of IDF soldiers conducting themselves terribly. Each example of this should be reported on and exposed.
So again, there's definitely something legitimate in saying it's not just about how a war is conducted, but the goal. I agree, but Hamas, Israel is not comparable to these other examples he gave. If you're gonna engage in a war that's gonna kill a lot of people, you should only do that if you don't have other alternatives, or if you have no better alternatives. So a lot of people like to bring up the Nazi example. Okay, well, the alternative to not defeating Hitler was almost certainly worse than the cost of trying to defeat him. The cost in not fighting Hamas the way we're fighting them is almost certainly less than the cost of doing what we're doing. So this is part of the moral calculation we need to take. What is the cost? What are our alternative options? Hamas does not pose nearly the same threat as Hitler did. Hamas, on their most successful day in history, so successful because Israel massively fucked up, killed 850 civilians, 1,200 people total. That's their most successful day in history. And I don't want to minimize it. That was horrific. But this is not like saying these are the Nazis that need to be defeated. It's just not. These are not comparable things.
And those responsible held to account. However, it's also true that this is to be expected in any war. If 1% of all human beings are sociopaths, and just humor me with that assumption for a moment, if 1% of all people are sociopaths, then out of 500,000 or so Israeli soldiers that have served in Gaza, you'd expect 5,000 of them to be maniacs. And that would be true in any war. How much damage could 5,000 heartless soldiers do over the course of a year and a half? How many war crimes could they commit against innocent Palestinians? And how much bad PR could they generate for Israel? Yet that's what we'd expect to see, even if the IDF were doing everything right.
So, okay, in Gaza, the situation is quite a bit different, right? So, first of all, it's not a problem of a 1%. The majority of the Israeli population believe there are no innocents in Gaza. The majority. There's also a very low level of internal regulation. The IDF is highly revered. It's the most revered institution in Israeli society. There's a social and political cost to holding soldiers accountable. So if you have a situation where it's just some percent are sociopaths, the solution is a high level of accountability. If a war crime's committed, they're charged with the crime. Now, this isn't a problem only Israel faces. Militaries generally don't charge their own at such a high rate. Okay. So this isn't only a problem Israel has. When you have a situation where the majority of the population that's currently fighting in Gaza believe there are no innocents there, and there's a low level of accountability, if you knew nothing else about Gaza and that's all you knew, you would expect an abundance and excess of war crimes that is unacceptable. And that very much maps the reality we are currently seeing.
Is the IDF doing everything right? Absolutely not. For one thing, the choice to cut off all humanitarian aid to Gaza for over 2 months earlier this year in order to pressure Hamas to release the hostages was, in my view, a mistake and arguably a war crime. Hamas has stolen enough aid to survive in its tunnels for a prolonged period. We know that. And they're completely unaffected by the suffering of their own people. We know that too. You can add to this the failed experiment in aid distribution that's been going on since May. IDF soldiers using live rounds for crowd control, which is to say shooting above people's heads to disperse crowds. But there are also credible reports of soldiers shooting civilians who are trying to get food and accidentally go into a prohibited zone. Now, some of these are tragic accidents and some are doubtless war crimes. But again, it's worth lingering over the asymmetry of war crimes even here. When an IDF soldier goes berserk, he commits a war crime. But every time a Hamas fighter shoots a bullet without wearing a uniform, it's a war crime. Hamas's entire MO is one big war crime. And unlike most wars, where each side is committing crimes against enemy civilians, in this case, almost all of the excess.
Okay, I mean, Hamas should be uniformed, and sometimes they are. When they pop out into the tunnel and go back in, they're generally not. But recently, when they did their big attack but this was like 2 weeks ago. Remember, it was like for 12 hours, they thought maybe soldiers got kidnapped. They were all uniformed. But there's a different extent of war crime. Shooting a soldier while you're not on uniform is not the same war crime as sending an elderly man into potentially booby-trapped buildings as a human shield, or shooting a woman or a child in a no-go zone, or destroying a home with an entire family in it because Hamas might be in a tunnel underneath. So you can't just use war crime as this general term and put them all equal. These are not the same thing. And it's worth mentioning, Israel has a whole unit of people who don't wear uniforms. That's the point of the unit. They dress as Palestinians, they speak Arabic, and then they'll sometimes assassinate people. So we do that too. But the main point is that that's not the same extent of war crime. It's just not. And also, I think that it's also important to recognize that nobody should be committing war crimes, but the more power one side has, the graver them committing war crimes is. With power comes responsibility. And the reason is simple, because irresponsible power is much more dangerous than irresponsibility of someone weak. So Hamas has a fraction of the military capabilities as Israel. So they're looking for any advantage they could get over Israel, the same way Israel is being risk averse and trying to get any advantage over Hamas. So one of the advantages Hamas takes is not wearing uniforms. And again, that's illegal under international law, but that's not the same as the war crimes we're seeing Israel commit, right? So I try to equate these as the same is kind of silly.
So one has to be skeptical about how the Gaza Health Ministry arrives at its confident conclusions, and one has to understand that their incentive is to exaggerate as much as they can get away with. And the less skeptical that we are as Western journalists, the more they can exaggerate without penalty. Again, the information pipeline here is just fundamentally broken.
I think that's a good point, actually. Now, what he says is what they could get away with, and that's why we need to rely on the fatality list they released, because that's not something they could get away with fabricating or lying because of its verifiable nature. So, and I talk about this all the time. If the Ministry of Health will just make a claim, that should be looked at with skepticism. But when they release the fatality lists with the names and ID numbers, that could and should be relied on.
Finally, I want to discuss the charge of genocide, because this is one of the most serious charges made against Israel. It's also, in my view, one of the most absurd. Genocide is the physical destruction, not the metaphorical destruction, not the destruction of property, but the physical destruction of a people in whole or in part. Israel's aim in Gaza is not to destroy the Palestinian people as a whole, nor to destroy Gazan Palestinians in particular. How do we know this? Because even if we accept the Gaza Health Ministry's numbers at face value, that is 60,000 people killed in Gaza in about 22 months of war. That is 3% of Gaza's population. You could argue that it's more than 60,000 dead because there are uncounted bodies tragically trapped under the rubble. But on the other hand, you'd have to subtract the combatants from that number as well, and the IDF says that about 20,000 combatants have been killed. To be clear, My default assumption is that both sides in any war are exaggerating their numbers. But for the sake of argument and fairness, let's just take both sides.
They're not exaggerating. It's an undercount. It's definitely an undercount.
At their word.
We know it's an undercount, and we also know that indirect deaths aren't included.
For a moment. So 60,000 dead, 20,000 of whom are combatants.
No.
That's about
No. I knew he was going to say this bullshit argument. Bro, at least do some basic research. We have the names and ID numbers of these 60,000. We know that there's not 20,000 combatants on the list. We know this for certain. There's not even a question. We have all the names and ID numbers, okay? I'm crunching some numbers here, but you can see every name, every ID number. You can see how many men, women, and children, okay? There's 26,000 men on the list, 9,000 women. Actually, it's going to be hard to show there, but we know that there's not 20,000. You can't do 60,000 minus 20,000. There's absolutely zero reason to do that. I'll pull up another chart to show you why. But the data's all here, so he has no excuse to make this bullshit claim. I mean, he has an excuse. People make the claim, and he just didn't look at it critically, but it's a ridiculous claim. There's zero basis to it. Anyone doing 60,000 minus 20,000, that's not serious. Call them out on that immediately. There's not 20,000 combatants on the list. It's plausible that there's quite a few combatants not on the list, but you can't do 60,000 minus 20,000. You just can't. Here's the chart. Okay. Females, males. This red line is establishing the baseline between males and females. Everything above the red line is excess male deaths. We see that excess male deaths happen in all ages, not just combatant ages. Combatant ages is what's darker blue. If we look at the average rate at which non-combatant males are being killed at a higher rate than females, they're dying at a 63% higher rate. So this yellow line establishes the baseline of what can potentially be combatant deaths. Everything above the blue line might be combatants. Now, why do males die at a higher rate? They take more risks like getting food, water, and aid. They're more confused for being combatants, and they're more likely to work in dangerous positions like first responders, journalists, etc. Now, while this establishes the baseline, there's only everything above the yellow line is 17%. But the same reasons why males of all these ages are dying at a high rate, that's even more true of military-age males. Military-age civilians are more likely to be confused with being combatants, more likely to take risks, and more likely to work in dangerous positions. So it's not 17%. It's less than 17%. This list is probably anywhere from 15% to like 1% combatants. There's not 20,000. There's anywhere from around 9,000 combatants here to just a few hundred. Now, this doesn't mean that only a few hundred combatants have been killed. These are confirmed deaths that are being reported on. This is all ID numbers that exist in the Palestinian Population Registry, which Israel can verify. We know from whistleblowers that Israel relies on this data. They confirm that they looked into it and that it's reliable. But the Ministry of Health might be omitting combatants being killed. So even if this list is 99% civilians, which it might be, right? That's within the range. That doesn't mean that the civilian to combatant ratio is 99 to 1, but it just means that any attempt to do this 60,000 minus 20,000 is bullshit. It should not be taken seriously. There's no reason to try to analyze it this way. None whatsoever. And in a few days, I'm going to release my new analysis going into all of this and how we can estimate percentages of civilians killed, et cetera, et cetera.
3% of Gaza's pre-war population killed in 22 months of war. Now, critics of Israel are fond of pointing out just how big the power disparity between Israel and the Palestinians is. And they are completely correct. Israel can do just about anything it wants. If the IDF chose to destroy Gazans as a people, they could kill almost everyone in Gaza in a matter of weeks. So ask yourself, why haven't they? And if your answer is international pressure, meaning they really would like to commit a genocide, except they don't want to become a pariah state like North Korea, well, then you've already conceded that they're not, in fact, committing a genocide. What you're accusing them of in that case is harboring secret wishes that they're not acting on. So we can have that conversation, but that's separate from an accusation of genocide.
Okay, what if Israel, their goal were to commit genocide while maintaining plausible deniability? What would that look like? How would that look different than what they're currently doing? That's a question that he needs to answer. So, genocide does not mean killing as many people as possible as quickly as possible. That's not what it means. So, if you're trying to destroy a population in whole or in part, and you could see a clear incentive for Israel to want to destroy the means of life in Gaza and kill some amount of the civilian population just because it will help them voluntarily relocate Gazans. So there is an incentive there for them to want to do this. But if they were to want to do this while maintaining plausible deniability, it would look awfully similar, if not identical, to what we're currently seeing.
The Nazis killed 60% of European Jews. The Turks killed over 50% of Armenians. In Rwanda, something like 80% of Tutsis were killed in 100 days. Those were genocides. And in legitimate cases of genocide, in which a smaller killed, it was because the genocidaire didn't have the ability to kill more. Now, we know that Israel could easily kill 50% or 60 or 80% of Gazans in less than 100 days if they wanted to, but they don't. And that's really all you need to know to be sure that Israel isn't committing genocide. The focus on what an Israeli defense minister said in his angriest moment after October 7th, or some truly awful comment made about Palestinians by a far-right minister, this focus is understandable, but it's actually misplaced. The reason we focus on what politicians say is to divine their intentions from unclear information, right? We're trying to understand what they would do if they had the power to do it. But in the case of Israel and Gaza, we don't have to divine their intentions because they're so powerful, they can already do whatever they want. Now, that said, if you do want to get into the weeds about what Israeli decision makers have actually said, as opposed to what propagandists claim that they've said, then you should read the Atlantic article by Yair Rosenberg called "What Did Top Israeli War Officials Really Say About Gaza?" For instance, one of the
It's true that there's been some misinformation about that.
most frequently circulated quotes, including in the New York Times, the BBC, the NPR, and the Guardian, was literally fabricated. It was a fake quote. And many others were deliberately taken out of context. So check out that article if you want more. But again, all of this is a little bit beside the point because the IDF is so powerful that the best indication of what Israeli decision makers are trying to do in Gaza isn't a cherry-picked quote by a minister. The best indication is what they're actually doing. And what they're actually doing is trying to destroy Hamas, an organization that started a war against them and is fanatically committed to their destruction. So there's more I could talk about, but in the interest of brevity, I'll leave it here. Whether or not you agree with everything I've said, hopefully you find something I've said useful. See you next time on Conversations with Coleman.
Yeah, that was weak. I mean, I liked a lot of what Coleman would say in the past. I think a lot of his vision for race-related stuff has merit, but this was weak. This was weak. Some good points, I guess, but I expected more Coleman. I expected more. We should try to get him on for a stream. I don't know if he would join, but that'd be a good one.